Pointing is a basic human behavior we take for granted. It's found in all human cultures. Even very young children understand it. To be clear, what I mean here by pointing is an instance of what is formally known as ostension, showing something to someone. As ostension, pointing is an indicative behavior in which it's understood that there is an invisible line extending from the pointing finger to an external object. But have you noticed that when you try to point something out to a dog, the dog just looks at your extended finger? A dog doesn't seem to see the invisible line extending to the object you're trying to direct his attention to. Once you notice this, you suddenly become aware of a huge gap between your mind and your dog's mind. Some ability that is fundamental to human social cognition is simply not present in a dog. What is this ability? The kind of pointing that research shows is unique to humans involves joint attention. One person is trying to direct another person's attention so that they are both looking at the same thing. This ability might seem pretty straightforward, but there are a number of even more basic abilities that are prerequisite to pointing in this sense. One of them is theory of mind. An animal has a theory of mind when it understands that other animals have minds of their own. This means, for example, recognizing that there's something you know that someone else doesn't know. Some of the smartest animals, like primates, some birds, and cetaceans, show evidence of having a basic theory of mind by which they can apparently conceptualize other beings as having beliefs. But to establish joint attention requires a more sophisticated theory of mind. I have to know that you have a propensity to single out the same objects for attention as I do, and you have to believe the same of me. Further, I have to know that you know that I do, and vice versa. This fundamental difference in cognitive ability can also be explained in terms of the fundamental difference between signals and symbols. A signal is essentially one-dimensional. It involves a producer and a receiver. For example, a sound made by an animal can be a danger signal that causes a response in its conspecifics to flee the area. Or a scent emitted by one animal can be a signal to a member of the opposite sex that it is ready to mate. Using symbols, on the other hand, requires a whole additional dimension. A symbol is an audible or readable token of information. Both signals and symbols carry information. Signals are produced and acted upon instinctively. Use of symbols, however, has to be learned. A related difference is that a signal that an animal produces intrinsically carries the meaning that it does because it evolved specifically to have that function. But symbols are arbitrary. For any sound or grapheme with a meaning, a different one could have been learned and used instead. Where signals simply operate according to a one-dimensional pattern of stimulus and response, symbols represent a concept. What all this adds up to is that the capacity to use symbols entails the capacity for language. Languages represent concepts by symbols, sounds, and graphemes, and it's an essential feature of language that the connection of the symbols to the concept is arbitrary. You can see that in the mere fact that you can say the same thing in different languages. We've already seen that joint attention forms a triangle. This triangle is what makes language learning possible. Language takes the form of learned symbols, which do their job by representing or having meaning. But what is it to represent or have meaning? Enter the philosophy of language. Of the many philosophers in this arena, Donald Davidson is my favorite. He uses a theory of triangulation to give a holistic explanation of what it means to mean something. At first blush, it seems that the content of a thought is determined entirely by the individual, and that that's what subjective content is. Davidson claims that this is incorrect. To me, Davidson's theory is the capstone of a long tradition of empiricism in philosophy that has tried to pin down the elusive status of thoughts. Davidson's theory of triangulation says that contentful thought begins with intersubjective communication. Davidson says that triangulation is when each of two people is reacting differentially to sensory stimuli streaming in from a certain direction. If the two people now note each other's reactions, in the case of language, verbal reactions, each can correlate these observed reactions with his or her stimuli from the world. The triangle which gives content to thought and speech is complete. So it's the intersubjective that gives content to the subjective. Davidson further explains that we only have the concept of objectivity on the intersubjective basis of recognizing publicly available stimuli. They all go together holistically, and you can't have one without all three. It seems pretty clear that the capacity to triangulate, which also underlies ostension, is the foundation for language. That's why we use ostension to teach language. So, in summary, dogs and other animals that can't triangulate don't understand pointing, for the same reason they can't use language. And they can't literally be said to think, because thinking is something you do with content, and for that you need language. You can teach them to associate certain sounds or other signals with behaviors or expectations. Our capacity for language means that we can choose an arbitrary signal to condition a certain response. But for an animal, it's still just a one-dimensional stimulus-response pattern. Because they're limited to this capacity, however good they are at learning, some tricks you just can't teach any dog or non-human animal.